Before we get into the book Miracles itself, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to the book. You can find a little segment of it on Wikipedia. Miracles is a book written by C.S. Lewis, originally published in 1947 and revised in 1960. Now, the book Miracles, I think in many ways grew out of the Socratic Club, which was an interesting aspect of C.S. Lewis, and probably this club is responsible for a good bit of the formulation of his apologetic work. And McGrath, in his biography of Lewis, has a nice little section on the Socratic Club. In 1893, the Oxford Pastorate was founded by a group of evangelicals within the Church of England. Now, evangelicals, when we use it in this time frame and in this context, does not necessarily mean how we use the term in America right now. There is some continuity, but most American evangelicals really connect to Billy Graham and what was called sometimes the neo-evangelical movement. But these were Christians who believed in the Bible, believed often in the centrality of the cross. And so when you hear evangelicals here, don't necessarily hear American evangelicals. In 1893, the Oxford Pastorate was founded by a group of evangelicals within the Church of England, with the intention of allowing Oxford undergraduate exposure to a more lively and intellectually engaging form of the Christian faith than what was usually encountered in compulsory college chapel. Now, at this time in England, many don't realize that England is technically a Christian country and the Queen is the defender of the church, as opposed to the United States, which is technically a secular country where we have separation of church and state. There is an official Church of England. And so in many ways, those who grew up at the beginning of the 20th century were subject to compulsory Christian education. And those of you who live in England can probably shed some light on that in the comments. I have a few friends in England who have talked a little bit about that, but England is obviously a very different place, especially since the end of World War II, as is much of Western Europe. From 1921, the pastorate came to be based in St. Aldade's Church, just south of Oxford city centre, close to the heart of the university. Although the Oxford pastorate was originally both pastoral and evangelistic in its orientation, its leadership increasingly became aware of the importance of apologetic issues. How could Christians engage positively as well as critically with the major intellectual issues of the day? Now, I want to make a comment about that word apologetic, because there are multiple senses of the word. Sometimes apologetics is the practice of proselytizing non-Christians into Christianity. That's one sense of the word. Another sense of the word is, I think, the practice of engagement of intellectual thought and ideas between Christians and non-Christians. And I see that happening in the wake of Jordan Peterson's work. And this, while Christians certainly want to convert others to Christianity, it's a joy that we have that we'd like to share. I don't think it's different from word of mouth endorsements of Jamba Juice or Starbucks, well, it is different, but the motivation comes from the same place in the heart. When you find something that you love and you make a friend, you want to share what you love with your friend. If you went to see Star Wars and you thought it was a great movie, you want to take your friend, and you're excited when all of your friends enjoy Star Wars. This is a simply human way of being. And so apologetics gives formal structure to a Christian come along and saying, I found a lot of joy in God. And a non-Christian saying, I've found a lot of distress in your idea of God, and I wish you'd keep it to yourself. And then maybe the Christian says, well, let's talk about this. Maybe we can, if I'm bothering you, I'll gladly shut up. It's not my goal to bother you. But if you'd like to talk about these issues, let's talk about them. And don't just pull your punches, but bring your best arguments and tell me what you truly believe. And hopefully don't be too afraid of hurting my feelings, and let me know, and we'll talk about it. And to me, this is great fun. And this is something that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Oxford pastorate, assumedly clergy and not early English evangelicals, because that word evangelical goes all the way back to the Reformation, and before, obviously, into the New Testament in a way. Too many equivocations here. But, so this is what they wanted for students, because you have students going to Oxford University. They're obviously learned, articulate, educated people, and so they want to love God with their minds, just like they want to love him with their hearts and with their lives. So although the Oxford pastorate was originally both pastoral and evangelistic in its orientation, its leadership increasingly became aware of the importance of apologetic issues. How could Christians engage positively as well as critically with the major intellectual issues of the day? How could Christian students find intellectual engagement and reassurance rather than bland spiritual platitudes? And in listening to many of the comments of many of you, and your disappointment with church, your disappointment with pastors, your disappointment with Christians, this is a big part of it. That okay, so Christians are enthusiastic and they want to share with you, but not all Christians are terribly able to engage with a lot of these ideas that perhaps you are. And so to me, there are a number of areas right now that are playing with this, and one of my favorites is the Veritas Forum, which you can find on major universities and you can find on YouTube and podcasts, where the Veritas Forum, I think, does an excellent job at setting the table and hosting terrific conversations between Christian intellectuals and non-Christian and even anti-Christian intellectuals. Unbelievable, by Justin Brierley in England, I think also does a great job of it. I think what's difficult about Unbelievable is that it's in a radio format, and by nature, a radio format requires frequent commercial breaks, and that breaks up the conversation, and I often find their conversations to be too short, which is where I find YouTube to be a perfect place, because I can sit and listen to these things 2-3 hours, and I can break it up if there's a phone call or a visitor, or if I'm driving my kids to school or something like this. So YouTube is really a wonderful thing, a wonderful forum for Christian apologetics, and I still do want to do a video comparing a little bit of Tim Keller's comments at the Kuyper lectures at Princeton Seminary with William Lane Craig, because I think there's some differences there that are helpful, and I think that explains some of the reason why probably some of you who wanted to hear William Lane Craig talk with Jordan Peterson, the experience was very much talking past each other, partly because Peterson is really slippery, and I don't mean that in a duplicitous sense, but to understand what he's meaning and what he's getting at has been taking me a long time. And actually recently I've had some help by some people who know Peterson fairly well, and that's been helpful for me to really focus in and understand what is Peterson using by these terms. But anyway, so in 1941, Stella Aldwinkle, 1907 to 1989, the pastorate's chaplain for women students decided the time had come to establish a student forum for the discussion of these issues. She came to this conclusion with after a conversation with Monica Ruth Shorten, a student of zoology at Somerville College, who complained that churches and religious societies just take the real difficulties as solved, things like the existence of God, the divinity of Christ, and so on, yet people clearly needed help to understand and defend these beliefs, which could not simply be assumed as true in Oxford's rigorously critical intellectual environment. And yeah, this is the case. And to be fair to churches are filled and supported and created by Christians who wish to have their faith strengthened. And this, I think, is a legitimate thing for churches and Christians to do, because it is, I've been making the comment in the comments quite a bit recently that if you want to be a Christian, it's going to be very hard to maintain your Christian faith without a church, because we are extremely social beings and we are always influenced by our surroundings. And so if you want to maintain your Christian faith, it's vital to find a church that has real people. Now, this is very, very difficult. I know I've heard comments from many of you that say, boy, I'd really love to have a church that deals with these things. And so I think YouTube and podcasts and books and all of these other forms can help sustain us, but there is no substitute for regular Christian worship. One of the topics I want to do a video on is Jordan Peterson's lack of church attendance and his creation of his own church, which is kind of a joke, but not so much a joke, because I think that, especially as a pragmatist, you can't help but ask him that, and demonstrate that this is indicative of something within him. And so when Christians come to me and say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I don't go to church, I'll often give them the warning that don't be naive with respect to what the lack of a Christian community around you means. This is a very complicated conversation in the Christian community. There are a number of Christians recently that have taken on the label as duns, and many of these see themselves as kind of uber Christians who, in many ways they are. They're leading nonprofits. They're doing wonderful work outside of the church, and they listen to podcasts or celebrity pastors like Tim Keller, and they say, I don't really need a church. I get everything I need from these things. Okay. I'm not your judge. The Lord is your judge. I have questions about that, because how I find the church shapes me in my normal life is so often through people who are not educated. And the church keeps me humble, because the church reminds me of how much I fall short in loving real and often annoying people. And that's a basic part of the Christian faith. And I think one of the things that I appreciate most about Lewis right now, I'm rereading Alan Jacobs' biography of Lewis, and I had read it soon after it came out about a decade ago and loved it, but I hadn't reread it since, and so I'm rereading it now and loving it all over again. I think I prefer Alan Jacobs' biography of Lewis over Alistair McGrath's biography. But one of the things that Lewis got right, and I think he learned it through this secretive relationship with Mrs. Moore, is just how common and banal our sinfulness is. And what that means is that our redemption gets instantiated and expressed in common love shown to people who this world certainly calls banal and rejects, which is why I feel so immensely blessed to be able to pastor a small, insignificant church that will never get written up in any famous magazine and will probably never be large or wealthy or powerful or influential. Because in a church like this, I can have real relationships with people that this world despises. And this is what I see in Jesus. And what's amazing about Jesus' ministry is that on one hand, in some ways, he couldn't hide his power and his luminosity, which drew the great crowds of the Galilee, but his honesty and his frankness just as quickly drove them away. And even his disciples had to figure out what to do with this man. And you see that borne witness to in John 6. But anyway, back to the Oxford Society. So Shorten, who went on to become an authority on the British grey squirrel, clearly saw the need for an apologetic ministry among Oxford students. And now what you'll notice here right away at the beginning of the Socratic Club, that, and we'll get to a minute how Lewis got involved with it, was scientists and Christian scientists. And I don't mean that in the terms of Christian Science, which is a Christian sect, or however Christian scientists wish to regard themselves, but scientists like Francis Collins, who is a convert. And you can, if you Google Francis Collins Christian faith, you can find he wrote a book about it describing how he became a Christian. There are many scientists who are Christian, and because of the way the conversation has happened in North America between science and religion, a lot of this detail that I've gone through, that it makes it very difficult on on scientists who are Christians. And so actually, I very much have a heart for that community, and it's my heart for that community that leads me into the treacherous waters in Protestantism of talking about science and faith. And that leads me into the questions about biblical interpretation and what to do with these early chapters of Genesis, and how can we both preserve this Christian this Genesis 1 ancient Near East representation, which in some ways is the platform upon which the entire symbolic language of the Bible is built. And I would argue that if we're going to use, say, archetypal language, that there's an archetypal element to this representation that continues to endure even in Western culture. How you need to, on one hand, preserve that while continuing to live in a world where Elon Musk is sending rockets up into orbit and intending to colonize the moon. Well, how do we keep those two worlds together? Well, this isn't easy, and scientists, when they're dealing with questions of biology and genetics, scientists have all of these issues, and so they recognize this in the early and middle 20th century at Oxford, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and said if Christian students are going to keep their faith, well, how can they do it? We need to help them. So after hosting a discussion of agnostics and atheists at Somerville College, Aldwinkle decided to establish such a forum across the university as a whole. In other words, I think it is a healthy practice for Christians to continue to host and invite unbelievers into a Christian forum, as Lewis will call it in a minute, into a Christian forum to say, let's talk. And one of my favorite passages in the Bible is where Paul in Ephesus is holding meetings in a large forum space, talking about Christianity. And we can imagine that he's there, as he did at Mars Hill. The Apostle Paul is talking with Epicureans, Stoics, the whole range of Jews, Paul himself being a Jew, of course, the whole range of ideas that were floating around at his time. And so this is, I think, something that the church needs to do, and something the church has not done well with, but it's something that the church needs to do for its health, the health of many of its people, and for, I think, evangelistic and even for the agnostics, even if agnostics and atheists never convert. This is part of bearing witness, which is what Christians are called to do. If this is any indication of how miracles is going to go, I'm never going to get through it. It's like Peterson getting through the Bible. So, the Socratic Club was founded as an Oxford University student society. Under the rules of the university, a student club or society requires a senior member, a don, who would take responsibility for the organization. Aldwinkle initially thought that the novelist Dorothy Sayers, a former scholar of Somerville College, might be appropriate. Now, if you've never read, Dorothy Sayers was a wonderful Christian intellectual, a wonderful Christian author. In many ways, a lot of what good C.S. Lewis produced, he can attribute to Dorothy Sayers, although she never was fully welcomed into the Inklings. You have this cultural element of English gentlemen that, although Elizabeth Sayers visited some of their meetings, was never part of that club, because this is a gentleman's club, and that has something to do with English culture. I won't go into it. I'm not English. But Dorothy Sayers, they originally wanted. However, Sayers lived in London and could not be counted on to attend regularly. An Oxford academic was clearly called for, but who should it be? In a stroke of genius, Aldwinkle bypassed all the safe choices, such as college chaplains. Not saying anything against college chaplains, but there's issues with being identified as a chaplain or a pastor and doing this kind of work, and went straight to the man she regarded as the rising star of apologetics at Oxford, C.S. Lewis. By the time the society met for the first time in January 1942, Lewis had soared to national fame. The Socratic Club rapidly became one of the most important university societies for discussion of issues relating to the Christian faith. It met on Monday evenings during full term. Lewis, usually present, was rarely the main attraction, on average speaking only once a term. Yet his presence was formidable. Most speakers sparkled with Oxford philosophical luminaries. Though the club was explicitly Christian in orientation, it was generous in its range of speakers. Evidence and arguments were the tools of the trade. As Lewis himself put in the first edition of the Socratic Digest, it was the Christians who constructed the arena and issued the challenge. We never claimed to be impartial, but argument is. It has a life of its own. No man can tell where it goes. We expose ourselves and the weakness of our party to your fire no less than you are exposed to ours. An interesting aspect of the Socratic Club has passed unnoticed. His members were primarily women. Perhaps this reflects the personal influence of Aldwinkle or its original links to the Somerville College. The membership lists for Michaelmas term 1944 records 164 members, of whom 109 were Oxford's 5 all-women colleges: Lady Margaret Hall, St. Anne's, St. Hilda's, St. Hugh's, and Somerville. And now, there were minutes that were kept of it. There weren't any recordings. It was, obviously early on in terms of technology. Boy, wouldn't it have been fun to have those things on YouTube, which again makes me happy for the Veritas Forum, because in some ways the Veritas Forum is a YouTube reincarnation of what I imagine the Socratic Club would be, or the Socratic Society, Socratic Club. But the Socratic Club, I think, had the different advantage of being a group of people that could meet regularly. And again, this is part of the reason why church is so helpful, because even though I'm, blasting out these things on YouTube, you can click in or click out. There's something about a regular meeting of individuals that have real life relationships. And that builds different things than, talks on YouTube and comment sections and some of these kinds of things. There's no substitute for real relationships. And this gets into something that I hope eventually I'll get into when we talk about Jordan Peterson and his beliefs. I increasingly see Jordan Peterson as somebody said to me, actually it was John Van Donk, my friend from Southern California, who's trying to wrangle some buckos down there. But John Van Donk said to me, in some ways Jordan Peterson is like the Magi. And I thought, boy, that just clearly fits. He sees the star and he goes to the east to bear gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh at the newborn king's throne. But, do Magi become disciples? We don't know. So Jordan Peterson is in some sense the Magi. I see him at that point, at least at this point in his life. Who knows what will happen? But you see, here's the one thing. Here's the one thing about reality. This little cell phone holder. This is in a sense what the materialists, the great strength of the materialist argument and the great power of all that a materialist perspective has produced and contributed to human society for good and bad, is that there's something to reality which transcends many layers. Now, Plato had a point that perhaps the form of cell phone holder will not decay while this form will. Okay, fair enough. But I'm going to rip off the ontological argument for a moment here, and don't you think that things which scale in time, see, this is a pretty durable little cell phone holder. It's not going anywhere. The church could collapse, and forensic people could find the thing. And I'm always amazed after some of the bombings, for example, the Trade Center bombings underneath. The Oklahoma City bombing, how these forensic scientists are able to sift through everything to tiny detail to construct what happened. Well, that bears witness to the enduring validity of the material layer. Now, here's the thing to think about. In a sense, the materialist worldview says, this little metal cell phone holder will in fact decay. Fair enough. And if the if the universe follows the course we expect it to, everything will decay and disappear. Okay. Well, now Plato has an advantage because, well, the form of cell phone holder won't disappear. But in a sense, the materialist position says, yeah, but the form of cell phone holder doesn't exist. Okay. Well, what if when we think about God, and in the Christian view, God made the stuff and gave us the wherewithal to actually, his glory is present in this little cell phone holder. And the heart of the Christian notion of resurrection is that this being that started all of this not only did not let his son see decay, but will not let his harvest of this age see decay. And that to me is an enduringly powerful idea. Now it's always hard to know. It's always hard to figure out what the great sifting will leave in and put out, because I'm not a universalist, and I think core to a reading of the New Testament is an idea of perdition, that some things will be lost. But I think also core to the Christian faith is the idea that even the fact of some lostness contributes to the glory, and we don't know how that works. A really interesting book that I probably should be on my reread list is Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace, where Volf really works on this question of loss. And I think Volf is an excellent conversation partner to talk about Christianity and secularity. He has one of the best quotes I know on the impact of skepticism about divine judgment has in terms of making life in the world worse. I've got that quote on my blog, and maybe I'll put it in the links on this if I remember. And if I don't remember, remind me in the comment section, and I'll drop it in the comment section. So yeah, this is sorry, see, if I don't do a PowerPoint, I wander, and these are the areas I wander into. So this was intended to be just a brief introduction to C.S. Lewis's books, Miracles. We'll start in very soon.